Good morning and welcome to the webinar. We recognize that many of you may be working from home or under various unique circumstances, as are we. So we appreciate your being here and are grateful that you are able to participate. Before we get started, we wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. First, a note about this webinar, which is produced by the CATA project, which is a project of the Center for Innovation and Resources. Funding for this project comes from the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, or Cal-OES. CATA aims to host a statewide mini-conference every year. In past years, we've covered topics such as breaking the cycle of family violence, commercially sexually exploited children, and male-identified victims of childhood sexual abuse. While we intended to host this year's mini-conference in person, as in years past, we've made the obvious shift to continue forward with a virtual training, whereas not to miss this opportunity to educate and dialogue with so many of you. I want to give special recognition to Taquelia Washington, who is one of our presenters today. Taquelia and I have been discussing hosting this mini conference on racial trauma since January of this year. And while we feel it is always the right time to engage in this conversation, we know that at this very moment in history, it is as important as ever. All that is to say, we intend for today's training to serve as scaffolding for what we hope to host in person in 2021, if it's safe to do so. And we look forward to continuing this conversation at next year's statewide mini conference. Please be sure that you are on CATA's email list to be notified of all upcoming trainings. Now, for those of you who can hear me, this might seem obvious, but to anyone who may still have their sound off or muted, this serves as a visual reminder that you must turn on your sound to hear the presentation. Please note that there are two features to communicate with us throughout the webinar. Please locate the Zoom Q&A feature on your device now and plan to use that to ask the presenter any questions you may have regarding content. We will plan to ask and answer those questions during the final portion of the training. You may ask questions anonymously by checking the anonymous box on the Q&A feature. Now please locate the chat panel and plan to use that feature to ask tech support questions. Select all panelists from the drop-down menu, and CATA staff will answer questions as immediately as possible in the chat panel. Please refrain from using either communication feature as a place for general dialogue as much as possible. We are so grateful for each of you in attendance today, but excessive text in the chat panel means we often miss valuable questions for the trainers. We encourage you to have these conversations with your colleagues, family, and friends as you see fit. We are offering CEUs for MFTs and LCSWs. At the end of the course, you will be prompted to fill out a general evaluation. At the bottom of the evaluation, you will click that you are interested in pursuing CEUs and will then be redirected to a second evaluation, application, and payment form. Please complete those to be eligible for CEUs. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website shortly. In the next 24 hours, you will receive an email that contains a link to the recorded webinar, a PDF of the PowerPoint slides, and a worksheet that our presenters have created for you to process what you've learned today. We encourage you to utilize that resource to aid you in continuing this valuable conversation. That email will also contain a link to an application for those of you who are interested in attending an affinity group session, which will be held next week as a follow-up to today's training. Space is very limited, and our trainers will talk more about what participation will look like at the end of today's session. And now I'd like to briefly introduce our trainers for today. Taquelia Washington is a licensed clinical social worker and is the founder of Empower Me Services, which focuses on helping those in the helping professions provide more culturally inclusive services. Joe Brownson is a racial justice educator and facilitator and is the founder of Tangled Roots, an organization dedicated to mitigating and transforming the impact of whiteness within the education sector and beyond. Amelia Ortega is a licensed clinical social worker and a professor of social work whose clinical services are grounded in anti-racist frameworks. Now, if you'll please give us just a moment, we will transfer controls over to our three incredible trainers.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're just going to spend a brief moment introducing ourselves, and then we'll dive into the content, starting with an agenda overview. My name is Taquelia Washington. I use she, her pronouns. I'm located in Oakland, California, and it is a genuine pleasure to be here today. Part of the intention that I have in presenting today is to not only be able to share information with you about trauma and how that shows up within the context of race and racism in our society, but to also to be able to specifically hold space for the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color that may be in our audience today.
Hi, I'm Amelia Ortega, and I'm located in Rhode Island. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm here in Rhode Island on Narragansett territory. My intention for today is to really connect with folks in the audience who may be multiracial or mixed identified, and to find a way to feel deeply connected to this so that you may want to attend the affinity group and continue your own work in the future around the topic of race-based trauma.
Hi everyone, I'm Jo Brownson, and I'm physically located in Holland, Michigan on Ottawa and Potawatomi land. And my home is in the Bay Area. I live and practice in Oakland, California. My intention for today is to be in community and accountable dialogue across racial difference and serve as a model and holder of the healing that needs to happen with my people, with white identified folks, in the context of white supremacy, and how we can move into more of our full humanity. And I'm very excited to be here in community with Amelia and Taquelia and all of you.
Thank you. So just to provide a brief overview of our agenda in terms of what to expect. Connected to what Ali explained, our hope for today had been to offer an all-day training, a conference focusing on the topic of racial trauma, healing, and resiliency. Because of our current times, we weren't able to do that. So what we've done is to consolidate the information into a 1-hour format. And so we want to name that really this is an overview. The intention is to provide you with an overview of not only what is trauma, but in particular, what is racial trauma? We want to look at who's impacted by racial trauma, and we're going to be looking at that from different perspectives depending on the skin that we're in as facilitators. And we're really going to be focusing the latter half on the training on looking at healing and resiliency, really calling in an embodiment practice and looking at how can we use embodiment as a tool for not only our own healing as providers, but also for those that we're serving in the community. We really are going to be inviting you to bring your whole self to the training today, and we'll be bringing our whole selves as well. And so part of what that means is that we're going to be sharing with you from an intellectual space. We want to be able to give you knowledge and information, but bigger than that, we want you to feel. We want you to go from both your head to your heart. And we want you to really notice what comes up for you as you're hearing the information, and hopefully spark for you a pathway for continued reflection, both after our training and possibly at the affinity groups next week. And hopefully we get to see you all in person next year at our conference once that happens. We'll also end with a little Q&A section. And so as Ali mentioned, if you have questions, you can feel free to put those in the Q&A box. And we hope to have time for as many questions as possible before we conclude. So starting to dive in and just starting to talk about what is trauma. So really there's two ways that we can think about trauma. Oftentimes when we think about the word trauma, we're thinking about experiences or situations that happen to either ourselves or to people. Those situations and experiences can happen on an individual level. It can happen on an interpersonal level, or it can happen on a collective level. So the situations and experiences. This is often the most common way that people talk about and think about trauma, and it is one way to talk about it. The other way to talk about and think about trauma is looking at the neurobiological perspective of what trauma is. And what that means is that when we experience a situation, an experience that is traumatic in our environment, there is actually a neurobiological response that happens in our minds and our brains with our brain chemistry that triggers in our body a survival instinct. When I talk about this, I like to talk about the fact that when we kind of scale back who we are as humans, at the very basic core piece of that, there's this animalistic part of who we are, where the number one goal of our body and our system is to survive. And so when we experience situations or experiences that trigger a trauma response, everything in our body goes into protective mode. Our nervous systems become activated, and we do what comes innate to us. There's lots of different ways that might look depending on what your trauma response is. At a core level, that could be triggering what we call a fight, flight, or freeze response. But either way, there's this biochemical reaction that's happening that's really rooting us into survival mode. And it's important that we think about trauma from that perspective because it helps to start to connect the importance of the embodiment piece around what's happening in our body. It's important to note that the same type of biochemical response that I'm talking about is also similar to what happens when we experience stress in our lives. Stress is universal. Everyone in some way, shape, or form is going to experience stress. Our bodies also has a biochemical response that happens in terms of stress. But with what we would call normal stress, healthy stress, our bodies are able to cope and regulate in response to those stress. But when we experience traumatic stress, the difference between that is it actually overloads our system and triggers us to go into this survival space. And that survival space overwhelms our ability to cope in those moments. And it actually starts to shut down part of our prefrontal cortex. So the idea of even being able to think, to be able to even tap into some of our executive functioning skills in those moments are near impossible because we're really focusing in on surviving. In a minute, we're going to start to talk more about what happens when you experience not just singular trauma, but what happens for those of us that have experienced compounded trauma throughout the course of our life. And from a biochemical perspective, what starts to happen when you've experienced complex trauma is that there's a way in which your mind, your brain chemistry can start to, what I call, get caught in overdrive. It gets almost stuck in this survival mode where we're constantly engaging in our environment and interpreting what's happening around us as a threat to us. And again, going back to that survival perspective, that's innate. Our body is no longer able to differentiate what is actually a situation or experience that can be life-threatening versus what is not life-threatening. We're constantly responding from this survival space. What's important to note about this is that this is where our resiliency lies. So going into the next slide, there's this piece about talking about trauma that oftentimes, especially for those of us that are clinicians, we often talk about trauma from a pathological perspective because this survival that I'm talking about, when that traumatic experience is done, if it is ever done, those same skills become maladaptive in our regular environment. But what we need to understand is that in that survival, in what is happening in our body response, there's tremendous resiliency and tremendous strength in that we can learn from. To be able to look at it from a strength-based perspective and a non-pathological perspective, creating that shift is crucial because in this is where our wisdom lies, particularly as we're starting to transition to talk about racialized trauma and racialized stress. There's so many different ways in which communities of color have been taught to deny our own wisdom. And what I want to encourage us to think about is, how do we look at our innate wisdom? How do we look at the ways in which our bodies are programmed to survive? How do we tap into that and learn from that? And I love this quote on this current slide that says, "They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds." So for racialized communities, for communities of color, there's been so many experiences and situations that not only have our ancestors experienced, but that we continuously experience on a day-to-day basis that really could bury us. But if we can learn how to tap into what is innate inside of us, that's going to be part of what's going to help us grow. And the next slide just starts to touch on that a little bit. We're going to be talking more about this concept of embodiment more as our training goes, but really what that means is, how do we tap into what's happening inside of our bodies? How do we tap into the sensations, the experiences, the movement that's happening, the energy that's happening in our body? And how do we use that as a tool for our own learning, for the own strengthening of our own resiliency? And then ultimately, how do we use that and teach others to use that as a guide in their own healing? And at the latter part of the training, we're going to be giving you some concrete tips that you can use to start to promote that. But next, we're going to be going into talking more about what are different types of trauma, to give you more of a lens into that. And with that, I'll hand it over to Amelia.
Thanks, Taquelia. So for many of you out there, you're working with trauma all the time, right? We can understand that trauma exists on multiple levels, and it also exists within our bodies, right, as Taquelia is talking about. So I want to break down a little bit further what kinds of trauma exist. So we have historical trauma. Historical trauma, we're talking about the conditions in our ancestors' lives, the experiences in our own families and our lineages, right, that our own people have survived for generations. And a lot of those survival strategies, as Taquelia is explaining, those survival strategies live on in our bodies. So we carry within us both the skills to heal and the tools to heal, and also a lot of the lineage that comes with our family history. Trauma is also systemic, right? So we have mass systemic inequalities that result in chronic traumatic impact, particularly for marginalized people. So here we're really talking about people of color, Black and Indigenous folks. And then trauma can be developmental. So relationships early in our lives with caregivers, people in our communities, can cause pretty significant interruptions, right, in our developmental pathways as we age. And so when we talk about attachment and we think about developmental trauma, we're talking about here how those interruptions in racial identity formation or in our relationship to ourselves as racialized people, they can really lead to experiences of racialized trauma. We could move to the next slide. That'd be great. So trauma is both discrete and complex. When we say discrete, clinically, we often talk about trauma with a capital T versus a lowercase t. Capital T traumas are often thought of as singular traumatic events, like such as an assault or a near-death experience or witnessing a death, right? So for many of you that work with individuals who are victims of violence at the hands of individuals or the state, you're very aware of these capital T traumas. But trauma is also really complex. So we can experience multiple significant traumas across our life course, right? And these are ongoing chronic traumatic exposures, right? And these can lead to something called complex PTSD. So we can understand trauma on a multisystemic level, and we can think about an exosystem that surrounds all of us. These are ideologies and really large societal belief systems. Macro systems, right, are institutions that we're all embedded in. When we say institutionalized racism, we talk about structural inequality. And then on a microsystem, right, that's our interpersonal, so our one-to-one, our family lives, our communities. For this training, we're really focused on the interpersonal and the internalized traumatic response and the capacity to heal. So we're really curious about how we can really develop a different skill set and connectivity around developing our consciousness for healing from our racialized traumas. We could move to the next slide, that'd be great. I'm going to pass the mic to Jo.
Thank you, Amelia. As Amelia spoke about, when we're thinking about racialized trauma, we really want to, as we're focusing on the inward, really lift up the relationship between our own individualized experiences and those ideologies that we're swimming in and breathing in every day, and the institutions in which our bodies flow and move and work in relationship. And so we want to spend time in this training really focusing on the specificity of racial trauma and how it shows up in our individual bodies as our bodies are racialized, but also in our collective bodies. And so as a white-bodied racialized person, there's a bit of a myth and a lie that I have been explicitly the target of, which is that white supremacy serves me. And there are material evidences to indicate that white supremacy does serve me materially and my people, right? We have hoarded resources. I have benefited deeply economically and other forms of resources just by nature of being in the body that I live in and having my ancestors live in the bodies that they live in and the structures that my people created around that. And as Taquelia mentioned, when we peel back some of what it means to be human, the lie that there are other people in bodies that look different than mine, that are less than human, is actually a lie that traumatizes me as a white embodied person. And so when we're talking about racial trauma, we're not just talking about the bodies that are targets of racialized trauma and targets of white supremacy, but also we're talking about what does it do to our bodies as white people and our ancestors? What did it do to their bodies to be perpetuators of violence, witnesses to violence, and to be in part of family and community systems that benefited from such a violent and dehumanizing system as white supremacy in this land we call the United States. So how our trauma shows up in our bodies is deeply related to how we are in relation to our racialization. When we say racialization, we mean how the media portrayals of messages about what it means to be white, what it means to be Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We mean how our bodies are seen and received in space with people who look the same and look differently than us. And so it's a socialization process. And how we're socialized is deeply related to also how we're responding to the trauma of white supremacy and its history. And I want to the last thing I want to point out on this slide is this idea of race-based stress. So to connect it to what Taquelia said, that we are exposed to race-based stress, and the kind of exposure we encounter is deeply related to our geography, the bodies we live in, and how we're racialized as well. Some consequences of racial trauma for different groups, and we're going to unpack this a little bit more as we keep moving, but I want to just highlight a few things that that now that we know a lot more about how the human body functions, we can actually draw some connections to patterns we see within particular racial groups and how they've been racialized in their bodies. So there's one chart here that's about the disproportionate number of COVID-19 cases, right? We are actually seeing that if you have been exposed and been a target of racism in your body and your ancestors' body, you are actually at more risk of having health difficulties, right? Physiological difficulties throughout your lifetime. There's a concept called weathering that a University of Michigan researcher did research on the impact of discrimination controlling for income on Black women's bodies when it came to infant mortality rates and other pregnancy complications. So that concept of weathering is really what we're trying to get at, where racialized trauma is not a singular event, as Amelia was talking about with that capital T. It's really about the cumulative impact of living in a racist system and a racist society that's designed to produce particular outcomes and hoard resources in very few hands, right? At the exploitation of many folks. And then the last slide is the opioid mortality rate by racial demographic. And the darkest line that you see going up, you probably can't see it very well, but you'll get these slides later. That line represents the mortality rate by white folks. And so I just want us to kind of sit with this idea of what does it mean that we're seeing epidemic in our communities that are filled with white bodies around deadening or using substances that make people sort of escape, right? So that we can also call that a consequence on ourselves as white people to racialized trauma and its disconnecting impact and creation of loneliness for us. It's important that I come back to, after showing you that evidence states, right? James Baldwin said, I don't know that whether or not white people hate me, but their institutions produce these results, so I have to go on the evidence. There are loads of evidence, and we're not here to prove whether racism exists, but we are here to really push us to think about, we can say all of the data and all the facts and present them to you, but we want to remember that it actually lands deeply on the body, that when we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about bodies, right? And Ta-Nehisi Coates has a quote that really drives that home for us. And I'll leave this just for a moment for folks to read before I move to the next slide. One example of this that I think is helpful to really bring it home is Taquelia spoke about how our bodies are deeply designed to survive. And we know safety, we have a sense of safety on an embodied level, or we have a sense of not safety. And so when our bodies kick into survival mode, that survival mode may have become detextualized depending on our trauma experience. We may not actually be understanding the reality around us. And what I want to argue here today is that when we see incidences of racism, where the white perpetuator of racism is disconnected from the reality of the threat, we are seeing a trauma response in action. And so this is a picture of Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper in Central Park. And Christian Cooper is a Black birder. He was out looking at birds, and he came across Amy Cooper with her dog off leash in a park surrounded by signs that say to keep your dog on leash. He asked her to put her dog on leash, and she escalated to the point of calling the police and saying, in particular, I'm calling the police and telling them an African-American man is threatening my life. That is decontextualized. That could have happened in 1920. That could have happened, in all of these different time periods in our history because of what Amy Cooper is carrying in her body and what emerged in that moment that was telling her her body was unsafe. And what was telling her her body was unsafe is the history of white supremacy that has conditioned white women in particular to believe that their bodily safety is under threat in the presence of a Black man in particular. So this is one example that we offer to indicate that relationship between how our body is in space when it encounters other bodies across racial difference, what happens in our sensations, and how our body makes meaning of whether we're safe or not safe. So we've shared quite a bit, and we want to, for everyone out there who's finding some resonance or seeing themselves reflected in some of what we're sharing, we want you to just think about an example. We use the term from the skin that you're in as a shorthand to talk about your racial identity and then all the other intersecting parts of yourself that come up in these moments of racial stress. So think about an example from the skin you're in and just take about 2 or 3 minutes to jot it down on a piece of paper near you, a journal, or sit quietly and think about it, and then we will transition to doing some storytelling. bring your reflection to a close or a pause rather. We invite you to continue to reflect after today. So I want to make a little bit of a transition as we are talking about this microcosm of our own bodies as universes of responses to trauma and stimuli and our society and those ideologies. We also know, because of the way white supremacy has been set up in this country, because of the way our bodies have been racialized, that there's a collective experience depending on how your body is marked in space, right? So bodies that are targets of racial violence and erasure and gaslighting, right? These are Black, Indigenous folks with our history of genocide on this land and enslavement or gaslighting. So this idea of questioning your own reality because of messages you're getting outside of yourself. The targets of those in this country, ironically is not the right word, but because of that experience and that wisdom that comes from developing a resiliency to your own erasure, communities of color in this country have actually developed a lot of wisdom collectively and resilience and strength and soothing strategies to heal racial trauma. And so bodies like mine and my ancestors that have materially benefited and are complicit in this system of racial violence and erasure, we've also paid a price, but it's a different price. We've lost healthy cultural touch points, right? White supremacy is about erasing our history of indigeneity or our connection to any roots that we had not on this land, and developing a sense of belonging inside of white supremacy. We also have lost the healing and resilience practices that, because we haven't actually been exposed to enough healthy stress around race. We haven't actually been exposed to the truth of our reality, right? So the difference, though, is that our trauma response, because the system's designed to protect our bodies over BIPOC bodies, Black, Indigenous, and people of color bodies, our trauma response is very different and very dangerous. So when Amy Cooper calls the cops, she's calling the entire system that has been built to see her as a victim in relationship to a Black body. She's calling that system to her defense. And that is something that our brothers and sisters across racial difference don't have that power. And that is why our trauma response becomes very dangerous to their bodies. And then there's other ways that are more subtle and insidious that racial trauma shows up in our collective communities. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this from our own experiences in the skin that we're in, about how some of the thought patterns that we've developed and our communities have developed have been in response to cumulative racial stress or racial trauma, how it's impacted our sense of where we belong, both as individuals and as folks who have been racialized similarly. What is our sense of our own control? Do we believe we are in control of our destinies? How is that racialized? And then the self-view, kind of to what extent are we taught to view ourselves in relationship to our communities and then to communities that look and function differently than we do. At this point, I'm going to take the slide down so that our videos are bigger and you can sort of just sit with some of the storytelling that we'll be engaging with one another. Hey, co-panelists.
Hi.
What's coming up for you when you think about these 4 areas of racialized trauma in our communities?
Yeah, I can start. I think I just want to name, before we go into the narrative, that I just want to invite those of you that are in the audience just to sit with yourselves, to notice as we're talking, as we're going throughout the presentation, just to notice what's coming up for you in your body and in your mind, and try to track that. There's going to be a wide range of experiences and feelings, and we want you to track that, but to also note both the wisdom and the areas of growth in that for you. And we share in this segment some personal stories, some personal narrative. And so in that, I want to also name that the intention is that part of our stories may resonate with some of you, and that we're volunteering our stories as a learning tool for you. And so there's some intentionality in this, and there's some choice and agency that we want to model around how we may choose or not choose to share parts of our story. And that feels important for me as a Black woman to name, because there's been so many ways in which historically Black women, Black people haven't had agency and choice over our voice, over our bodies, both historically and contemporarily. And so for me, I'm always humbled to be able to use my voice, to be able to use my experience, to be able to use what I've learned and the pain that I've experienced in life as a tool to be able to hopefully help to reach and to be able to help teach other people. So when I think about the themes that Joe just covered, and I think about the various ways in which those themes show up for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, it really hits all of those different categories. When we talk about growing up in a society where racial trauma and racial harm is so prevalent, the impact of that on our communities is so pervasive. It impacts our thought patterns, our sense of belonging, our locus of control, our self-view. It really hits all of those. And a large part of that is because of the negative racial socialization that happens not only in the United States, but worldwide often. There's so many ways in which we are, as a larger community of color, as this larger umbrella, constantly bombarded with messages that try to teach us that we are something that we're not. That tries to teach us that we're supposed to be this square, that we're supposed to act and talk and dress, etc., in certain ways that may not be natural to who we are. And if we're not careful, if we're not mindful, if we're not consciously teaching ourselves, our children, our community something different, it can be really easy to internalize that. And I can say for myself, growing up as a young Black child in this country, there were so many different ways in which I internalized those beliefs. There were so many different ways in which I internalized this belief about myself as a young child that taught me that who I wasn't enough, that I had to always be better, that I had to always try to do better, that I always had to, just give it that much more in order to feel and to be seen as good enough. There was ways in which I internalized standards of beauty that didn't resonate with who I was. There was ways in which really I was taught to hate myself, to loathe myself, and I didn't even realize it. And it wasn't until I had the privilege, because it really is a privilege in a lot of ways, to be able to access higher education, to be able to take ethnic studies classes, specifically African American studies classes, that my mind was like raised, my consciousness, my wisdom was validated, and I was seen and taught different ways of being that actually resonated with me, my family system, and my community of origin. And so it wasn't until I was afforded that opportunity to unpack and unlearn, and many other experiences that helped me to return back to alignment and return back to an authentic way of being and moving in the world, that has been such a key part of my healing. And that's ongoing for me. That's not past tense. I constantly have to stay in practices that are going to promote my own healing, that are going to lift up my resiliency, so that I can have the fortitude to be able to continue to move forward in a way that's in alignment in this world. I'm curious for either of you how your stories may be similar or different based on the skin that you're in.
Yeah, I'm listening to you, and I'm really thinking about sort of young me growing up in a light-skinned mixed body, having a Mexican dad and a white mom in New England. And sort of when we talk about the possessiveness of whiteness, right, sort of this systemic project historically in the US of white supremacy sort of just claiming, right, anyone that can be claimed, about the difficulty for myself and a sibling, and also many mixed people that I interact with now as an adult, these narratives that we kind of light up when we find out we share a similar trajectory of really having that similar sort of awakening moment with the message, what would happen if you could both really acknowledge and take accountability for light skin privilege and also not have to give up your heritage. So that there has been a great loss for a lot of mixed families and not having language. And this is systemic, right? That if we don't have mirrors and language to talk about race in our families, we talk about that ecology of change, that how much we can change institutionalized white supremacy. Also, there's a lot of beautiful work that could happen starting with families that are given tools and lenses for parents to say, to talk to their children at earlier ages about racialization and about light skin privilege. And so, you know, I think about sort of the losses there and how that connects to sense of belonging. And something I say quite often still as I'm continuing to kind of emerge and develop and reconnect to parts of my own Indigenous heritage is that, you know, sometimes for many mixed people, whether there's a white parent or two parents of color in a family, we're really asked to choose based on how we're projected. We become sort of projection screens for who we grow up around. And so this idea of belonging everywhere and nowhere all at once really sometimes resonates for mixed identified folks. So I think about the losses there, and I think about sense of belonging and a sense of self, right? How we have to really learn to reconstruct that by tapping into, again, sort of the duality that comes with growing up in a binary system. Yeah.
I really appreciate hearing both of you share and kind of lifting this idea of belonging and also its relationship to how we view ourselves in relationship to the world. And I think about for me what it has cost me to think that I was quote unquote normal, right? That part of whiteness and how it functions for white people and white families is to the majority of us in the last 50 years or so have really tried to raise children as if we live in a colorblind society, and if we can just make our young people be nice, that will solve this huge historically constituted dilemma that we face. And what I think for me that cost me is that as a young person going through education, the education system, absorbing the propaganda that my ancestors just did the best that they could, and civilization means white, civilization means Europeans, that, you know, there was an equal battle between Native Americans and European settlers, and the Europeans just won. Like all of the ways that the folks that were reflecting my racial identity were in positions of power and at worst, like benign, right? Just like, they're just normal, they're just here, they're harmless, really came to a head for me when I entered the classroom as a teacher in Southwest Philadelphia at 23. And I was the only white body in my classroom. And I had done some work. I had read James Baldwin. I had done a lot of the things that I thought I needed to do intellectually prior to that. And then there was an experience I had there where my assumption that my body is benign and my lack of understanding how my body was being viewed by my children of color and by the administrator, who was a Black woman, created a lot of harm. And specifically, there was one instance where I invited my younger brother who was visiting me to just come to the school, thinking, again, we're benign. We don't really have anything to be threatening because we're just like normal humans. And he entered the school and I got a call from the principal, and never have I felt up until that point, the being called out in that way had been something I hadn't experienced. And it was transformative for me to have her say, how dare you bring a strange man without asking me into a space with children. And just like that level of hubris that I had is deeply connected to not being taught explicitly by my elders and by people around me who were supposed to be teaching me what it meant to be white. Created so much harm that could have been avoided had I had some of that earlier on, had I understood my own self in relationship to how I was seen by others across difference. And I echo the ongoing work that takes to kind of disrupt all the racialized patterns that I have been conditioned to enact.
Well, I'm thinking about how we're all speaking to this developmental piece of belonging and messaging and negative socialization patterns, right? As well, and what that means then when we talk about system change or that ecology of change. Do we believe, or are we taught? Do we have a sense that we actually can belong in a movement for change, or does it feel like that movement is moving without us in some way? So how we plug in to moments and the ways in which we might have really internalized, as you're talking about, Joe, like normalcy or marginalization or not enoughness, that all of those things, in this microsystem work, the IO, the internalized oppression, works to keep us all disconnected, right? That's one thing I'm really hearing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you both for sharing. And I just feel really honored to share this space with you all and just to be able to share in this way. And I want to reflect for the audience that part of our core belief in doing this work is that in order to be able to help other people heal, we have to first do that work for ourselves. We cannot expect that we can hold healing space and to be able to strengthen other people's resiliency if we have yet to do that work ourselves. So part of our intention in sharing is to also be able to hold space for you to be able to also do your own reflection. And so we want to pause for a moment, and before we go more into the healing and resiliency section, we want to just pause for a minute or two to give you space to be able to sit in not only all of what you just heard us share, but to also start to do your own reflection, to start to also reflect on how have you been harmed? How have you been targeted? How have you internalized? How have you perpetrated some of what we've named? How have these themes showed up for you in your life? And we're intentional in starting there before we even can start to go into how you might do that for others. And so in this transition, we'll pull back up the PowerPoint, but we're going to just pause for a minute or two and then invite you to reflect during that time. Ideally, if you have paper and pen, this could be a great time to journal. You may sit in silent reflection, you may draw, you may move your body, whatever feels in alignment for you in this moment. So just gently inviting you to wrap up your last sentence, perhaps your last thought. And as was mentioned at the beginning of the training, we've created a take-home reflection guide that each of you will be getting after the training along with the PowerPoint. And those questions are really designed to help you to continue in your own self-reflection process and to be able to go deeper within yourself. And it also gives you some questions and tools that after have done that work yourself, that might allow you to be able to use those questions as you're working with others as well. For now, the last part of our training, we're going to be rooting into talking about what healing looks like from this context. And from there, I'll hand it over to Amelia.
Thanks, Taquelia. So we'd like to talk for a few minutes about healing. And one thing I wanted to say is that Taquelia opened us up with really thinking about the neurobiology of trauma. And one thing I really want to ground us in when we think about healing is to understand that the same functions of the brain that really carve in those neural pathways around holding traumatic memory in the body, right? So the body keeps the score, that idea that our body holds that history. That same exact function of the brain is also the function that moves us and works with our brain-body connection toward healing and toward resiliency. And so we call that neuroplasticity. And it is something that all of us as human animals get to have and to work with all the time. So I love this Adrienne Maree Brown quote, that how we are on the small scale is how we are at the larger scale. The patterns of the universe repeat at scale. Right? So this idea that, as Taquelia said, that when we start with ourselves, we start with our own stories, we start with our own projects of where in our personal identities, where in our personal stories we might have opportunities to notice that we've done harm. For mixed folks, we have a really interesting project sometimes of holding a lot of duality and complexity. And one thing we know is the trauma brain is not a brain that wants to hold complexity. It moves to very quick binary. And so this idea that how we are on this small scale repeats in a pattern to the universe, right? That we can offer a lot of complex, nuanced thinking. We can offer nuanced story sharing from our own experiences to the larger project of addressing structural change and structural harm. So our body is constantly moving toward healing, right? That's just I love this statement. I try to say it once a day, which is to remind ourselves that we sleep because our brain needs to heal. We have a wound and instantly our body starts to do a process to close that wound. But our body wants to return constantly to a state of equilibrium. It's seeking that. And race-based trauma is sending all of our systems way beyond our equilibrium, right? We're constantly miscalibrated. And I think to Joe's point around the Amy Cooper story, right? That story was, captured the national spotlight because it was such an example of calling on this system to do harm. And that same way that our bodies are constantly moving toward healing, you can see what the evidence is of when we aren't doing the personal work, that we're often acting from a place of deep historic miscalibration. So I think that from a strength-based perspective, for all of us just to ground into the idea that we all wake up every day with an opportunity to heal in some unique way. We all wake up with an opportunity to say, today, let me figure out where I might be able to heal for myself. So healing can look like respite for our nervous system. For some people, respite for the nervous system is activated. It means getting your heart rate going. It actually means really joining a sense of getting energy up. If your system tends to be kind of low and you tend to feel a little bit more low energy, and respite for the nervous system for many people looks like doing something that we'd consider maybe traditionally calming. So a meditation or getting grounded. It can look like slowing down, and it can also look like moving energy up. And healing is complex, of course, right? It's ongoing and it's constant, that the body's working toward that all the time. And we can induce that healing, right, by participating in particular interventions and activities, and most of all, neuroaffective relational pieces, right? If we want to use some clinical language, but noticing other people, right? Noticing that we're not alone.
And I want to just add, Amelia, if I could, that this
Yeah.
is, when you're speaking about healing, I want to really draw a distinction between healing and some of the mainstream ideas about self-care, right? That this idea of self-care in a consumeristic framework or a capitalist framework is about looking outward for things or situations that will heal us. And I think particularly for white folks, this idea of healing is so tied to what we can consume, because that's part of our legacy, that I just want to underscore that the slowing down, the internal work, the embodied work is that orientation might be uncomfortable for folks in white bodies in particular because of just that alignment we've had with capitalism for so long.
Yeah, and I appreciate you adding that, you know, that all of this is not for sale, right? That neuroplasticity is innately within us. So we can, and I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about this, that concept of sanctuary within the self. Yeah. So I wanted to just introduce one model, and the PDF of this model is publicly available. You can Google it. But Chavez and Duenas et al. Have this incredible model that came out about a year ago. The HEART model stands for Healing Ethno-Racial Trauma. I think it's really adaptable to a lot of different work environments and also for our own personal projects around healing. So the HEART model was developed for work with Latinx community around racial trauma. A large majority of new immigrants actually coming to the US and then experiencing US structural racism. So the HEART model posits that to really start the healing process, we need to establish sanctuary spaces to move into and to be able to start to acknowledge and reprocess and learn to cope with the symptoms that we've been describing today of ethno-racial trauma. And that through thinking about creating sanctuary and learning to cope, we can strengthen and connect communities and individuals to new survival strategies and cultural traditions that heal. And all of this is really aiming for this goal, right? That we all get to move towards our own liberation and acts of resistance in our communities. You know, what I really appreciate about this model is that it's universally applicable here to this idea of creating sanctuary. One thing we've gotten wrong in traditional models of trauma healing is that we have to stabilize first in order to then be able to heal. That's sort of a general principle, right? We can't do the work unless we have a foundation. We're talking today about race-based trauma. We don't have a stable foundation. We have a lot of systems every day that are sort of chronic and complex. And so we really are working toward and working with this theory of change that we can create sanctuary anywhere that we are, right? That we can create sanctuary here today with you for this hour. We can create sanctuary every day on our own in the moments that we find to really be with ourselves and sit with the complexities of what we're working with in terms of our harms and healing. And I'm going to pass the mic on here.
Thank you. And building off of the piece around the embodiment piece, building off of this idea of giving our nervous system respite. Because racialized trauma is complex, because it's ongoing, and for at least the unforeseeable future, it's never ending, the idea of finding strategies to give respite to your nervous system is going to allow your nervous system to be able to rest. And even 5 minutes of respite for your nervous system every day is going to be able to give you more stamina, more resiliency, more ability to tap in so that you can go even longer. And for those of us that are working with survivors, that are working with victims, that are holding space for those that are also actively experiencing their own trauma, having our own skills to be able to have respite is going to be crucial for our longevity. And so in these next couple of slides, and you'll get these, so I'm not going to go over all of the details of them, but what I want to highlight is that we don't have to search for anything new to look for tools for respite for ourselves. Speaking specifically for communities of color, our ancestors have been doing what we now call mindfulness practices since the beginning of time. That wisdom lives in our family, that wisdom lives in our community, and that wisdom lives in our bodies. And so this slide gives you some examples of some ancestral practices that have been done across communities of color since the beginning of time that might have resonance for you to be able to use as practices for yourself. And you might find that you're already drawn to some of these practices and maybe haven't conceptualized it in that way. But anything that you can do to like bring a pause, a stop, a rest to your mind, to your body, to your energy is going to be the respite that we're looking for and that we're talking about. The next slide gives you some more kind of tools to think about as you're thinking about using intergenerational resiliency as a source of healing and coping. Some of this talks about things like reclaiming your power. What does that look like for you? I talked a little bit about what that looks like for me, but what does it look like for you to reclaim your power? Consciously centering joy. I love that one. That's one of my favorites, because within systems of oppression, within racialized trauma, folks of color are not meant to experience joy. So for us to consciously center joy, to center laughter, can be a part of our healing path. And there's some other things and ideas in here that you can read and kind of research on your own. The last one around inner child work, there's a lot of research and articles out there that might be really helpful, but that's really connected to the developmental trauma that was talked about earlier. And to be able to find tools to do your own inner work can be really helpful in your own healing journey.
In the skin that I live in, this one around telling your truth resonates so deeply with me as a white person because of the ways that the lies are intergenerational in our family systems. And I find it so deeply healing when I'm with other white-bodied folks and we can tell the truth about our history, we can tell the truth about reality. And as a young person, when you're witnessing such unfairness and then being fed a lie about it, that has impacts on our own sense of what's true. And so when we think about reclaiming these ancestral practices, for white folks, we really need to tap into some creative energy about what does it mean to create culture and healing around being anti-racist, around developing an idea of unlearning our whiteness as cultural practice, right? That we have to find other ways to belong to one another and to create sanctuary with each other that are not culturally appropriative, because Amelia spoke to this possessiveness of whiteness, right? To not steal, not go to India to find ourselves, but what does it actually mean to create culture as a white-bodied person that is not replicating some of the same traumatic experiences of our ancestors in the past. So I just wanted to do a little meaning making for me around listening to the two of you talk about accessing these practices.
So I'm noticing time and we have about 4 minutes left before we transition. So I wonder about maybe talking through this piece and then we can go to the next step slide.
So we want to invite you, we don't, for the sake of time, we're not going to actually do a full embodiment practice, but we want to really underscore this idea of creating sanctuary where you are. And we want to just invite you now to do a brief scan of your body. Just do a brief moment where you're sitting, noticing your edges, noticing where your body's meeting the chair that you're sitting in. Maybe take a moment to look away from the screen and take some breaths. So this idea of regulating as it relates to our race-based experience of racism and race-based stress is really about how we practice when we're not under racial stress, the slowing down and the regulating of our nervous systems. And so again, we won't do a full embodiment exercise now for the sake of time, but I wanted to invite you to just find in your body where you're feeling constriction, where you're feeling tension, and maybe just do a movement to sort of release some of that, to shift the energy around as we transition to talking about next steps and then receiving some question and answers. Would either of you add anything to that before I move to the next slide?
I would just add, just connected to Amelia's point earlier about there's infinite number of practices that you can choose to adopt for yourself, and not one practice is going to work for everyone. And so I would just encourage you to find practices that work and resonate for you. So as we move toward wrap up, what we want to name and just continue to acknowledge that in the hour that we've spent with you, this is very much a high level overview of a very big and complex topic, but we hope to be able to have provided you with some framework of understanding and hope to spark within you a desire to continue in your work or to start your work in your own healing process, whatever that looks like in the skin that you're in. Some of the tools that we have for you are, one, the home learning handout that will be available and emailed to you. This webinar is also being recorded, so both the recording and the home learning handout will be available on their website at some point within the next couple of days, I would assume. Next week, as mentioned, there's going to be a unique opportunity for a small group of you who are interested to go deeper in reflection in affinity. What that means is that in affinity, we are going to have 3 affinity groups. I will be hosting an affinity group for people that identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Joe will be hosting an affinity group for people that identify as white. Amelia will be hosting a group for people that identify as biracial, multiracial, mixed identity. In the link, which will also be sent to you, there's descriptions of what that means. And so if you're not quite sure where you would go, read the description and that'll help give you some guidance around it. And the purpose of the affinity group is to allow us to hold space for you to be able to do your own reflection in community around some of what we've talked about today. In addition to that, COVID willing, we're still hoping to do the all-day conference around this topic to allow us to not only go deeper, but to also have traditional breakout conference workshops that are designed to give you more dimensionality of the learning. So with that, that ends our portion for today. We're going to open it up for some question and answers. But as we wrap up, I just want to personally say thank you all for attending. And it's truly been a pleasure to be able to just speak to you and just to hold space in this way.
I would echo that.
Absolutely.
Allie, would you like me to stop sharing so that you can take over?
You can stop sharing. Well, actually, you can leave it. Well, it doesn't matter. You leave it that way. We're just going to ask questions verbally. I wanted to thank all 3 of you thus far. There are so many great comments and lots of gratitude in the Q&A and chat section that you probably can't see yet. As you all know, most of our attendees and participants are folks in the helping profession, and most, if not all of them, work with children and sometimes young children. So a very common question is, how do we have these conversations with young children who maybe aren't our children in our home, but children that we're working with in a professional setting? And of course, as always, if you have any resources or recommendations on books or other places that folks can go to learn about how to talk to kids about race and trauma.
I would start off by just saying, as a kind of a reminder or context for that question, is that children start to categorize even based on race at an age that's tremendously younger than what we would kind of anticipate. So even prior to 1 year of age, there's evidence that shows that children are already starting to categorize and group people, but it doesn't mean that they're giving meaning to it. And it's not until they're socialized to have meaning that they're starting to understand some of the social nuances of how we're describing race and the impact of that in our society. So I say that to name that children are oftentimes ready for this conversation at a much younger age than what we might anticipate. So depending on your role in your relationship with the child, one, I would want to make sure that I'm honoring the family or the community's preference around how to engage in these conversations. And then I would want to engage in alignment with that, but making sure that I'm also using kind of age appropriate language around it. We've talked about creating a resource list for the affinity groups next week, but we can make that resource list available to everyone that's attended today that can give you some further resources around that. Is there anything that you two would add to give more depth to that?
You know, I just think about stages of change and sort of really doing a job of assessing where families' culture and structure might be in terms of whether they are interested in talking about race, as Taquelia is saying, but also that representation matters so greatly, and young people seeing themselves in books, in film, in content really will matter. And I know that next week in the affinity space I'm facilitating, we'll talk probably a lot about that, and whether or not generationally we've seen a lot of shifts with mixed and multiracial families being represented in children's literature. A lot of the publishing imprints are sort of just catching up in the last 3 years to the vitality of this market. But you know, that I think that there's a lot to be said about a visual image that represents who a child is, that allows us to have a mirror to the world.
The only thing I would add is that, you know, Taquelia and I have co-facilitated workshops with largely white parents. And one of the things that they push is this question of how do I talk to my kids about race? And one thing we really want to emphasize is this is really where the embodiment practices come in, because young people and children are sensing you energetically before they have words to describe what they're sensing. So if I, as a white mother, am taking my white child into a space that has bodies across racial difference and I tense up, I'm sending a lot of communication about what's safe, how safe I feel, how safe they should feel. So that work of embodying yourself and putting yourself in situations where you are getting some healthy stress around race to work through whatever implicit biases or things that are coming up, your own racism, will communicate volumes to a young white child in how they should be responding to bodies of color.
Thank you. The next question we're going to move into is, how do you respond to the white fragility and cognitive dissonance that individuals may have that produce strong emotions or strong reactions? And lots of questions about the idea of folks being triggered, and if white folks might be confusing being triggered with experiencing some cognitive dissonance.
I mean, you can see all of our heads nodding. I can just start by saying, I think, you know, there's nothing prescriptive to how we respond in the moments when white fragility is being enacted. I think one of the things that's really important for me as a facilitator in the skin that I'm in is to notice ways that that participants, both white participants and participants of color, have been socialized to take care of white feelings and really center and contort ourselves. We all do this. We all contort ourselves to make sure that we're not activating the racist person in the room or the white feelings or the white woman who's going to have some tears. And so it is absolutely built into our nervous system to confuse discomfort with cognitive dissonance, right? To feel under threat when we are just asked to speak about race. And so, you know, the work of holding the space and decentering and really focusing on the impact versus the intent, you know, that could be a whole workshop in and of itself. It is. So I won't speak any more about that, but really just the noticing and reflecting back what's actually happening helps, I think, for folks who are in their fragility.
I would just add that there's different philosophies around this, and so some of it may depend on who you're talking to, and a core part of our philosophy and our collective work together is utilizing affinity groups or utilizing the importance of having allies. And so I, as someone that works in a collective community that centers racial equity, part of what I've learned in my process is that there's only so much that I, as a Black woman, can do to help to support a white person in their white fragility. There's a part of my work that I do that's holding and supporting that. And there's another part of that where there needs to be another white ally that's going to be able to hold and do the in-depth reflection and healing work that actually needs to happen for that transformation to take place. And so there's a piece of that I can do, but there's a limit to how far or helpful that would be for me to hold without perpetuating what we're actually trying to dismantle. So part of our philosophy in that is the importance of having white folks work in affinity with each other and have accountability with each other to be able to support each other in being able to like unpack and heal those responses that are happening.
And I would add, depending, I don't know who asked the question, so what the context of your work might look like, but that if you are someone who has capacity and the relational, ability, there's a relationship there to really actually help some folks drop into what it is that they're experiencing and start to really name and identify what's happening in their body, that might be an opportunity to talk about the difference between discomfort or stress from actually what we would consider a clinical trigger, right? And that we want to get really much clearer with folks about language. And sometimes having a new frame is really empowering for someone to say, oh, I was using the wrong language, but this also fits for me, right? So I think if you have that space to do that, it's a great opportunity. Just around languaging.
Perfect, thank you. I recognize that we are right at 11:45, and so we will probably lose some attendees, which is fine, but I'm wondering if I can just pop in one last question that I think would be a great way to wrap it up. Some folks are asking the best way to make this work for themselves, like the self-work that they're doing, but also in their professional settings to continue this work, make it sustainable and ongoing so that it's not just a conversation that's happening now while headlines are kind of at the forefront, and a way to make it sustainable in their work environment as well.
We're all pausing to be polite to see who wants to jump in first. I will jump in and just say, one, that I love that question. I love that you all are thinking in that way, and it's something that we grapple with a lot. One, I would just highlight the importance of doing it not just alone in your self-reflection, but to find deep community to do that in. And we believe that in order to center racial equity, in order to dismantle systems of oppression within the context of an organization, the type of work that you're naming is crucial to that. But in order for that to be a longevity, like something that's going to last over time, you have to have the buy-in from top down, bottom up. And that buy-in has to be both financial, but it can't just be financial. We're talking about not just the internal transformation, but really a systemic overhaul that's going to take dedication and commitment to the process, as well as the messiness that oftentimes that can come up during this process as equilibrium is being disturbed. And so I would just say that the buy-in is going to be really important.
I think I would only add that, as Amelia pointed out in their response to the white fragility piece, is that this work happens and can only happen in the context of relationship. And so there is no silver bullet. And again, it's rooted in our own sort of capitalistic mindset that we could just like do this one thing and then we could solve this very complex problem. And so we want to move at the speed of trust. And we also, as Taquelia said, want to be fostering relationships at each level of an organization so that the transformation can happen at all of those levels and through and leveraging the relationship, not from a sort of place of scarcity and whatever word I'm looking for, like consumerism.
Yeah, and I'll just say that means sort of building your team or building your community. And your community could be you and one other person. So this is sort of also about really recognizing capacity and burnout, that you alone in a large organization, if you're the one who's constantly bringing it to your team meetings, often asking for PD on this, really pushing like your agenda, which is really actually not your agenda, right? But a really shared agenda. Having one other person who you can volley back and forth with and say, you know what, this week I'm really worn out. I'm really angry, or I'm in my rage, or I'm in my grief about this. Can you handle it this week, right? And really being able to have the relationship to say, you know, I can't do it by myself and I need someone else to step in, where there's space to acknowledge that we all get tired. So I also think the sustainability and the longevity is about getting to know what are your signs and symptoms too, that you are in your own trauma response and might be in flight response, right? And saying, I'm just going to leave the job because it's not changing. But then we find out that these systems are all systems, right? So a part of that creating sanctuary can include creating sanctuary with others.
Brilliant. Thank you. I want to thank the three of you so much. This was a really lovely and beautiful hour, and the folks in the chat are expressing a lot of gratitude. And so I also want to say that at our peak, we had over 600 people here. And so I feel confident that those folks are going to take this work back, not only to their families and their environments, but to their workspace. And this is much more than we could do in person. I don't know of a room that could hold all of us that large that we could access. So thank you to everyone who was here and participated, and thank you to our three trainers, and we will sign off.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Be well.
Thank you. Great to be with all of you.